Hello and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby and I'll be your driver on this journey. Apologies for the slight technical delays there at the start, but we're up and running now. And tonight it's going to be a little bit of a vanity class where I go over what I believe to be the best chess games that I have ever played. These are some games that I really enjoy, and I think they have some instructional value, and I probably know these games better than almost any other game of chess because I played them. So let's jump right into it. My first game here is going to be up against Julian Proleiko, and I think this might be the closest to a perfect game of chess I've ever played. Don't know if I'm ever going to get there, but it started with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, and bishop e7 by Julian. So this bishop e7 line is a pretty interesting one. Julian, I think, played this specifically because he knew what I generally played with the white pieces. With the white pieces, I like to play after knight f6, the main move, c takes d5, e takes d5, and bishop g5. I was playing this exchange qgd and putting this bishop on the most natural square on g5. Now, obviously, bishop e7 is targeted at preventing this move, bishop g5, so I think Julian played it just to get me a little bit out of the stuff that I was normally playing. I still captured on d5, which is pretty normal, e takes d5, and now rather than bring the bishop out to g5, the bishop can just come out to f4, as it did in this game. Now, Black has to be a little bit careful about these pawns. He would love to develop this bishop, but he does need to solve some of these problems first. For example, bishop f5, queen b3 might already be giving Black some very serious issues. So c6 was played first, guarding this d5 pawn thoroughly. Now e3 is very natural, and now the move bishop f5 comes on the board. And now, at this moment, there are a variety of ways you can play with the white pieces. However, while I was vaguely aware of some of these ways, I wasn't very confident that I knew just exactly what I was doing in a lot of these lines. For example, the main move here is actually something you might not expect. Black has put this bishop here specifically to guard the d3 square. And so Black is very happy if he gets the trade of these bishops to go through, because this light squared bishop is often one of White's strongest minor pieces in this kind of structure, with all the pawns on the dark squares in the center of the board. I've said this before, I'll say it again, it's all about this light squared bishop for White in these kinds of structures. So because of that, White's main moves here revolve around making this bishop feel a little bit less comfortable staying where it's at, guarding the d3 square. So believe it or not, the most common move in this position is actually just the move g4. You just directly challenge this bishop and make it move away. If it tries to stay on this diagonal, well, guess what? Now comes on the board the move h4. Really, quite seriously, trying to get rid of this bishop. If bishop takes h4, you're asking for a little bit of trouble here with the move queen b3, when all of a sudden this queen can't really keep an eye on this bishop and come over to guard the b7 pawn, so b6 would now be forced. And then this is just not the most comfortable position. Knight f3 could come with tempo. I think there are various other moves. Rook takes h4 is apparently just totally winning. If queen h4, knight takes d5 is crushing when this is coming on the board. And if you capture, this rook is trapped. So g4 is some fun stuff. However, I figured that my opponent had probably looked at this, and I had not. So I just played the simplest move, which is bishop d3. And this is sort of giving Black everything he wants here. He gets to trade off the light squared bishops and has a pretty comfortable game. But I was fine with equality out of the opening, so this is what we went with here. Bishop takes d3 now, and now queen takes d3. And knight f6 by my opponent. Finally, this knight does get developed now that the purpose of the bishop on e7 has been served. And here I played perhaps a slightly strange looking move. Already, now that my queen is not on d1, I felt that the move knight h5 was going to become a pretty serious threat to get rid of my dark squared bishop as well, so I went ahead and played the move h3 just directly here, giving this bishop a place to run in case of knight h5. Now castles, knight f3, and my opponent actually plays the move bishop d6 here, going for a trade of the other bishops. And I'm not so sure that this was totally required, but I don't think this is a bad move at all by Black, because while looking at the bishops on f1 and f5 that got traded earlier on, this was obviously advantageous for black because this is my quote-unquote good bishop with this square being able to control all sides of the board. And while this is black's quote-unquote good bishop, it's not really so simple here. Because really, this bishop isn't helping too much on the current square it's on. You know, it controls some squares on the king's side, and definitely some squares on the queen's side. But really, my quote-unquote bad bishop is turning out to be a lot more active than this bishop on e7. It's controlling more important squares on the queen's side. So bringing this bishop to d6 and trading it off actually makes a lot of sense here for black, because while this is the good bishop versus the bad bishop, this was a very, very active bishop, and that's really what matters. So bishop d6. Here I could have just ignored the bishop trade and let him take on f4 if he so chose, but instead I went for the simple option again and just took on d6 and castled. Now my opponent plays the move knight b d7, and this is the first moment when I would really like to pause and ask the chat room to think about this position for a little bit. So obviously, objectively, it's tough to claim that white could have any kind of serious advantage here. Both the bishops have been traded off the board, both sides have fairly equal development, and yeah, I mean, neither king is weak. It's tough to point out a specific advantage that white has. And in fact, objectively, the evaluation of this position is just equal. However, I do think that practically, it may be the white pieces here that have a little bit of an easier time playing this position. So why is that? Well, it's because chess is all about plans. And here, I think it's much, much easier to find a plan for white than it is to find the plan for black. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask you guys at home to figure out the plan for white. What does white want to do here? And why is it difficult to find such a plan for black as well? What do you guys think?
Where was this game played?
I believe this was the September nights of 2019 when this game was played. So Daniel is saying rook b1 and then b4, b5 for white, rook c1 or a3, and these are all very, very reasonable moves. Santa Slayer is saying black doesn't have good squares for his knights in regards to the second question I asked. So Andrea is also saying rook b1. And yeah, rook b1 I think is the right idea here for white. And the idea is, of course, just the standard minority attack on the queen side. We push the b pawn forward, we try to take on c6 and create a weakness over here for black. And now as for why it's more difficult to find the idea for white, or I mean, sorry, for black, well, that's just down to the fact that we've traded off so many pieces. While the pieces being off the board might eventually help black if he does end up with this weakness, there being fewer pieces on the board means it's slightly easier to play the position with the less space on the queen side. But with fewer pieces on the board, that means black's plan of potentially attacking on the king's side or, you know, even driving a pawn down the board, these types of ideas, which don't always happen in these Carlsbad structures, now they can kind of never happen, though. These ideas are sort of never really working for black, because with the absence of the bishops, it's tough to get this kingside attack going. You know, you kind of need this random bishop floating on e6 ready to capture on h3, or this bishop on d6 ready to drop back to c7 and deliver some kind of checkmate for these kinds of attacking ideas to work. So what does that mean? Well, that just means that black is going to have to meet white on the queen side rather than go for active play on the king side. And that's why I think this position is just a little bit practically easier to play with white. You know, white's plan is still totally functional, and black's plan is now sort of just to prevent white's play on the queen side and to try to fight him on that side of the board as well. So rook a to b1 was the move that I played in the game, and I do think it's the best move. And now almost every time this position has been reached, black has played the same move, which is sort of the standard response to seeing a move like rook a to b1. Of course, that move is a5 by black. a5 is sort of the normal way to slow down these b4 ideas. Now, there are a few things that you could do with white. queen c2 makes a lot of sense to guard the a4 square with the idea of pushing a3 and b4 to follow. You can play a3 immediately. You just sort of run the risk of seeing this pawn land on the a4 square, when after b5 and a knight landing on c4, you might live to regret allowing your opponent to take so much space. Just as an example line, queen c2 and already b5 is well worth considering for black here. Once again, with the idea of the knight coming here. So instead of this, my opponent actually came up with a different sort of plan. Julian played the move a6, and I do think that this is just a slight mistake by Julian in going for this plan. I think he did this because he was trying to play for a win, and after a5, once again, it's just the sort of game where black is trying to meet white on the queen side rather than, play for his own active play. And a6 is actually an attempt to get some very, very active play with the black pieces. So after b4, my opponent plays the move rook f to e8, just a good improving move, guarding e4, pressuring e3. And now I play the move knight a4, and then I'd like you guys at home to see if you can understand Julian's idea. What was Julian thinking when he played this move a6? What did he want to do here? Oh yes, 2019, not 2020, Jeff. And Subakura. So yeah, Subakura says you usually win as black by storming the king's side. So that's what I was talking about, right? It's very difficult to storm the king's side when you've traded off these two bishops. And I think that's the huge downside to playing this line with black. It helps solve a lot of your problems to get rid of the bishops, but it also takes away a lot of your active plans with these bishops that would potentially be very, very strong looking at white's king's side. Santaslayer says b6, Jonathan Croats says b5, Mohammed says b5. So yeah, Julian's idea was in fact this move b5. That's totally accurate. And he went for this position because it is a lot more imbalanced than the positions we were looking at earlier. For example, in his dream world now, I play the move knight c5. In his dream world, this knight is on c4, and black is sort of just chilling, right? Chilling with the knight on c4, pressuring this guy. Then threats of f5, f4 are coming not so much with an attack on the king, but just an attack on white's center with this e3 pawn being a little bit troubled. However, I do think that this position is now just going to be better for white after this trade. For example, if you play the move knight b6 here, just sort of ignoring this knight on c5, well, your knight on c4 is actually a lot less relevant than the knight on c5. And the reason for that is this knight is doing a great job of pressuring a6. It's already threatening some jumps like knight b7 in the future, and knight c4, while it does pressure certain squares, these squares aren't going to be relevant for many, many moves. So see if you guys at home can figure out the idea to get an advantage with white here. What do you guys think white should be doing now that black has ignored the knight on c5? Note that this is not actually what happened in the game. What Julian played was a little bit better, but I do want to examine this because it's important to understand. Why do we need to include a6 for b5? Is it just a waiting move? That's a good question. So let's say rook e8, b4, b5. If you don't include a6, then the move a4 might really gain in power. After a4, you're going to have to play the move a6 anyways, and I'm not so sure that this is totally ideal. For example, now a5 and knight b6 is stopped, and then we might just be piling up on this guy pretty directly. And you don't really have time to play this, because of course I have made a threat to your b pawn. So a6 is preparing to play b5 kind of regardless of what white plays, and so I play the move knight a4 to at least get my knight to c5 before that. A lot of people are saying the move knight e5, and knight e5 is not a bad move at all. It does a great job of attacking c6, but I don't think it's actually the clearest way to sort of play for the advantage here. And then, sorry, let me... All right, I've kind of lost the thread of where I was. Here, this knight b6. It's the same position, but I was in a different line. I think the most direct way to play is to immediately go for this move a4. And when I say immediately, I don't mean immediately, I mean after rook a1. Rook a1 is actually a great move here for white, just getting on the a file and preparing to sort of advance this pawn. For example now, if knight c4 and a4, black is never taking this guy, and white is taking b5 sort of at his leisure. You can kind of double up first if you're really, really feeling it, and at the end of the day, it's going to be white who decides when to open the a file, and with this kind of power of decision, white is only going to open the a file when it's favorable to him. Notably, black cannot in turn kind of try to double up rooks, because the minute this rook lands on a7 or this rook on c7, we can take on b5, and there's an awkward pin on the a file. So pretty awkward position here for black, actually, with this idea of rook a1 and a4 kind of directly. Okay, so in the game, though, Julian does snatch this knight off the board, and this sort of loosens my control over the a4 square, loosens my control over a6 as well, and it forces me to decide which pawn to kind of take back with here. Now, this is a case where there is very clearly a better way to recapture. If you take back with the b pawn, this is actually not at all the structure you are looking for with white. I don't know if you're much worse here, but you very much could be, because suddenly the move c takes b5 after a move like a4 is very much worth considering for black when he would have connected pass pawns on the queen side. No reason to give your opponent this kind of structure. Instead, c takes is much better, queen c7, and now with this capture, we actually have the added bonus of giving our knight a nice, juicy little square on the move on the square d4. Now, once again, try to find the idea, the plan, what have you, for white here. Of course, it's actually going to be just the same thing as we just looked at. The move a4 is what I played in the game, and it's the most direct. There are definitely some improving moves that white could have played first, but I think a4 directly is perfectly fine as well. Knight d7 was my opponent's response. Once again, his idea with this structure is to clamp down on the c4 square, and so now he's bringing his knight out to this square. And this is kind of what I mean when I said that practically I do think this is an easier position to play with white, because when black tries to go for these active kind of plans, trying to give himself a square for this knight, trying to create problems for white, well, he's giving up a lot. And in this case, black has given up a little bit too much for the sake of getting this clear plan. And now white, I do believe, is just significantly better. Now, I will say that this next move, I believe, is the one major mistake that I made in this chess game. Otherwise, it would almost be perfect. But the next move I played was slightly subpar. So let's evaluate this position a little bit. I know my opponent's next move, basically. I know he's trying to play stuff like this. I don't know for certain that this will be his next move, but I know his idea, right? So how do I want to increase my advantage here, and what are some potential issues to look out for, right? So in a perfect world, let's say I could make 8 moves in a row. This is my perfect world. I get to do this, and I get to take here, right? This is my perfect world, right? So what is stopping me from reaching that perfect world? What is stopping me from getting to this point? What is black going to be playing? Because even if you get this guy here, if you just waste a little bit of time, we're back at my perfect world again, right? So what is black going to try to do to stop me from getting to this optimal setup with my rooks doubled on the a file? What do I have to look out for? What's this opening called for white? The QGD exchange? Yeah. It's one of many ways to arrive at the Carlsbad pawn structure. I'm not sure what you mean by that line, Aaron. Black wants to take on a3 and attack the weak b pawn. I think Mark means a4, and he is pretty close to the truth here. This is sort of the one threat that black has in the position where he is the one that gets to decide the change in structure. So more specifically, after b takes a4, let's say white passed here, now all of a sudden it's black with some very serious opportunities to fight for the advantage. So what black is threatening is to first take on a4, and after a move, for example, like rook a1, just to make a bad move, the threat is now a5, when this knight is attacking c5, and this pawn has nowhere good to go. For example, b5, knight takes c5, and black is pretty much just winning here. So black is not without threats in the position. So the question is, what can you do to make b takes a4 sort of a bad move for black? That's kind of the best way to approach this position, because honestly, black doesn't have many other threats. Like black can put this knight on c4, but that's about it, right? And the knight on c4 isn't really threatening to win anything. It's just a good knight. So we know black's one threat in the position, so how can we try to stop it? There are a few different moves that are playable here. It turns out that the move knight d4 is actually the best move in this position, and the reason is, now if b takes a4, we can just play the move queen a3, and we are defending all of the relevant squares very, very directly. In the game, I played the move queen c3, and it turns out this is almost as good, but we'll see why there is sort of a key difference here just in a little bit. So I played queen c3, the point being now, if black tries to play this line with b takes a4, this is actually what happens in the game. Now I'll play the move knight d4, and a5 is going to be met with b5. And this is actually now a very, very favorable position for white. If cb5, rook b5, and look out, this pawn is defended, and this pawn is rolling. A difficult pawn to stop now on c5. And this is sort of the advantage that I'm playing for with the white pieces. I want to get this strong passed c pawn and use it to win the game. So in the game, after knight d4, my opponent didn't directly play a5, and instead put this rook on b8 first, just kind of challenging my claim to the b5 square. So the question once again is, did my opponent make a threat? Does he have a threat here? And the answer once again is actually yes. If I pass, then once again the move a5 is my opponent's threat. Well, what's the difference? The difference is he's defending b5. Now if b5, cb5, there's no rook b5, because rook takes b5, knight takes b5, and queen takes c5 is picking up my only chance at an advantage and leaving black with 2 extra pawns. Definitely not what I'm looking for here. So once again, the thing we always tell beginner players is to check your opponent's last move, check if it made a threat, and turns out that's a pretty useful idea in a slightly higher level chess as well, past the beginner level. So how do you want to solve this threat? Well, I'll tell you how I solved it in the game. Solved it with the move, who has it? Rook f to c1, just supporting this pawn from behind. Now the move knight e5 comes on the board, and we're kind of at a standstill now. So how do you make progress here with white? Well, of course, you need to pick up this a4 pawn. That is just the cleanest, most natural way to make progress. So how do we do that? Well, we want this rook here to support b5. We want this rook here to support c5. And so we can move the queen to a3, still supporting c5, and now coming up to a4. In the game, my opponent opted for the move a5, challenging me very, very directly on the b4 square. And so, of course, I play the move b5 as intended. And what's the issue here? Well, the issue now is that after cb5, we once again have a situation where after rook takes, knight takes. It's true that this is going to be slightly favorable for white, but due to the slight awkwardness in the white pieces, there's going to be an annoying pin here on this knight on the b file, and because of this, black is likely going to be able to kind of hold this position with best play. So sort of a missed opportunity there for black. This is also the reason why queen c3 was a bit of a mistake, because if we go back and I had played knight d4 here, and we go down the same exact kind of line, let's see, what's the order in which everything happens? Yeah, b takes a4, then all of a sudden I can play queen a3 in one move instead of two, and I'm just getting kind of the same line except with a tempo up. So that's why queen c3 was a bit of an inaccuracy, losing a tempo in the game. So queen c3 to a3. Now the move a5 comes on the board, and after b5, my opponent very quickly actually made the fatal mistake in this game. And in that case, the mistake was bringing this knight to c4, which is not what you would expect the mistake to be, right? Seems like this was the whole point of black's play, but now we do see that this is the crucial mistake because it forces my queen to come to the a4 square, and now I have this rook defended with the queen directly. So in the game, we see cb5, rook b5, rook b5, and now, of course, I'm not going to play knight takes b5, but rather queen takes b5. And this is, once again, going to be a very pleasant position for white. Now, after the move a4, it is white to move and get a very much winning advantage here. So white to move and essentially just win the game. Try and come up with a few moves, generate a line, find some candidate moves. Don't just guess at the one move threat, because even if you're correct, then a lot of the time when you guess at the one move threat, sometimes the one move threat is not correct, and then you wind up in a little bit of trouble. So what do you guys think here? How do you win with white? Only after the game did I find out, Mark. I thought I played like a genius in the game. Can't you break the pin with queen d4? You can, Beltron, but then black just takes your knight, you take black's knight, and at the end of the day, it is actually just going to be an even material major piece endgame, which black should be able to hold if he plays well. Definitely, you'd rather be white in that position, but is it winning? Probably not. So there's a few different ideas in the chat room here. So yeah, these are all relevant ideas. So the move you don't want to play is a move a lot of people are suggesting. I really don't like this move, rook a1. Why don't I like it? Well, it's actually an okay move, but the point is you want this rook behind this pawn for a couple of reasons. Number one is an idea some other people have suggested, which is the idea of playing the move e4. E4 would undermine this knight, and it's nice to have this rook here ready to capture this knight at a moment's notice. So I like having this rook on c1. I think rook a1, while it is trying to pick up this pawn sort of for free in many cases, I don't think this pawn is totally relevant. We'd much rather advance this pawn rather than try to round up the a pawn, in my opinion. So the correct move here is the move that a lot of people are suggesting as well that I haven't mentioned. It's the move c6. We guard the d5 pawn, and as far as queen b7 being a threat, I don't think it actually is just yet, but it's certainly an idea that black is going to have to contend with. For example, if just a3, sort of nonchalantly ignoring everything, queen b7 would be not good enough because this pawn does end up getting rounded up by the rook. Of course, though, a3 would hang this pawn, which was kind of my point. So instead, the move knight b6 was played by my opponent. And now, once again, I would like to ask you guys to find the win in the game. And this is where it's kind of crunch time. At this moment in the game, I figured I was probably winning. I just needed to find the right continuation. So what is the right continuation after knight b6? Now rook b1 is fatal, says Subakara. Kura, rather. Kura? I don't know. I don't speak other languages very well. Well, hello, Tarquin. You're welcome for playing a chess game. Everybody says rook b1. Rook b1. All right, I guess rook b1 does win the game. But this is sort of what my opponent was hoping for, I think. I think my opponent was hoping for this when after a3, you better be careful about taking this guy when you have to have a response to the move a2. Turns out queen takes queen is a good enough response to a2 because white is actually still winning this position despite being an exchange down. Obviously, though, there are simpler ways to win a chess game than going an exchange down on purpose, so this is not to be recommended. Definitely not to be recommended here. So, rook b1 wins the game, but If you guys all saw that you end up down in exchange, I don't believe you. Aaron actually has the right idea here that I just revealed on the board. But yeah, rook b1 here takes a2 is actually a very serious issue. Queen c7 is the only move that wins, and then black gets a second queen, but unfortunately is unable to deal with the threats of the pawn queening after knight f5. When this is still winning. Knight f5, by the way, the only move that wins here, so hope you guys knew what you were talking about when you all said rook b1. Anyways, I didn't see that in the game, so I chose the simpler way to win, which is the move queen c5. And the point is, you are simply clearing the path for this knight to come to b5, and then with that, you are very much winning the game. And this, quite frankly, is an unstoppable threat. If you're playing with the black pieces, I suppose the best try is to just plant this knight on c8 and hope for the best, but knight b5, queen a5, for example, c7, and now this knight is sort of in the way of your own pieces. If a3, this pawn is very much capturable, checkmate is threatened, so g6, and even a move like rook a1 here is going to be good enough. A2, for example, just even king h2. And white can kind of win on this side of the board. This is probably the best that black could have hoped for, though. Instead, in the game, he did make a mistake rather quickly. Rather than knight c8, he tried the move queen a7, which doesn't make the most sense in the world. At this point in time, we were both fairly low on the clock, and so queen a7, I think, is just a bit of a mishap. Always a good credo to play chess is hope for the best. I agree. So, c7, of course, now that the square has been vacated, we push the pawn forward. h6 played by my opponent, and now there are many moves that win. Knight f5 wins here, which is the most direct to just challenge the c8 square. I went for style points here with knight c6, highlighting the fact that queen takes c7 loses a queen. The queen moved to a6, and then I went for super style points. Rather than play knight e7 and queen and go up a piece, I decided knight b8, laugh in your opponent's face, say, no way, no how are you getting to the c8 square rook. I will block you with my knight. Queen b7 came on the board now, and then finally, in time pressure, I relented and played not the most accurate winning move, I am ashamed to say. I simply captured this knight on b6, and after queen b6, I made a queen, the king came to h7, I gave this check, and I captured this queen. And I quite easily won this endgame with an extra piece. Of course, there were other ways to win that were maybe more convincing than a full extra piece. For example, rook b1 now is going to be a very good move. If a3, we do actually have time to just capture this piece and capture back. And now, of course, c8 is a full extra queen as opposed to just an extra piece. But in the game, queen takes b6, c8 queen, and that was enough for a victory. The game went on for a few moves, but I did not record them as it was time pressure, and it was sort of irrelevant to the game. I did go on and manage to convert this. The A pawn isn't really all that scary when the white king is just as in the game as the black king, and the knight can help kind of corral the pawn. So not so scary at all. Okay, so what is the point of this game? The point of this game, I think, really is not so obvious. The point of this game really lies in the trading of the two bishops here. On the surface, it feels like the trading of these bishops is going to be advantageous for black, right? Black gets rid of this bishop on d3, gets rid of this active bishop on f4. Those were two of white's best pieces. How can black be worse when white's two best pieces are off the board? And the fact is, black can't be much worse when those two pieces are off the board, but practically, it does create sort of a situation where black is sort of searching for a plan, and it's not so easy to find one. As Subakura said earlier on in the class, often he wins these types of games by pushing on the king side. But this type of plan can really only be supported when you have a bishop somewhere on this diagonal and a bishop somewhere on this diagonal to help attack a lot of these weakened squares on the king side. And with black just missing those bishops, nothing much to do. We saw in this game, Julian went for something with b5, controlling the c4 square, but it did end up giving the advantage to white. So, the moral of the story is be careful when you make these kinds of trades, because if you're not careful, then you could end up in a position where you just have nothing to do. Each trade drastically changes the nature of most chess positions, and so it's really important, well, first of all, that you think about every move, but that you think especially carefully whenever you offer or accept a trade of the pieces. Okay, hopefully you learned something here about that, general points, and also about this kind of structure with the move a4 being a key point for white here. There's a ton of value in being able to control when you open the a file, and that's why white is significantly better here. All right, moving along to game number 2. This is a game that I played against the one and only Katerina Nemcova, and I believe this was from the 2017 Bill Wright St. Louis Open, and this is a game that I'm quite proud of because of things that happened in real life. I love this story because it makes me feel so cool. It was the Saturday before the Bill Wright St. Louis Open, and Katerina was actually our Grandmaster in residence at the time. And me being a youngster, I was like, why don't I use up one of these GM lessons that I have? So I go in to take a lesson with Katerina, nothing but respect for Katerina, and she teaches me a few things that I was working on at the moment and giving me some advice. And then the next Saturday, I go to play in the tournament, and Katerina plays, and then I end up paired with Katerina. And unfortunately for her, this is one of the best games I've ever played, and so obviously it did not go her way, and then I believe she forfeited from the tournament thereafter. She's just so disgusted. If she's losing to Patzers like me, how can she keep playing in this tournament? Anyways, the game went d4, e6, c4, f5. We have a Dutch. I go for the move g3, which is the most common move. Generally in the Dutch, it's a lot less common to bring the bishop out to d3 against this kind of structure because black is very solid on these light squares. And so it makes a lot more sense to go g3, bishop g2, and challenge the queen side of the board instead. Katerina played the move knight f6. I go bishop g2, and she plays c6, now sort of telegraphing that she's going for the stone wall. I play knight f3, and now after d5, we have very much arrived in the stone wall. And there are a variety of ways you can play this position. I go for this move, bishop f4. And bishop f4 is a pretty interesting idea. The point is it's going for a very distinct change in structure that you'll see a little bit later on. Now there's a variety of ways that black can play against it. You can go bishop d6 directly, which would potentially allow the move bishop takes d6, but also might just allow something like e3, and the change in structure I'm talking about is here we actually usually take back with the g-pawn, controlling this e5 square quite thoroughly, but also leaving this f2 pawn in reserve so that if needed, it can come to f3 and control some key light squares in the center and on the king side as well. So in the game though, bishop e7 was Katerina's choice. I went ahead and castled, and we see castles by black as well. Now I actually bring this knight out to c3, and sometimes actually this knight is a little bit better suited on the d2 square. Here I don't think it makes too much of a difference, and we'll talk about why in a moment. Now knight h5 was Katerina's idea, and here potentially I could save the bishop with the move bishop e5, but I was very comfortable going for this structure that I was sort of familiar with, so I just play the move e3 instead. Now knight takes f4 is perfectly playable, but rather than g takes here, I think white should very, very seriously consider playing the move e takes f4, sort of opening up access to this e6 pawn. And this is likely why Katerina did not take on f4 in the game, because this e takes f4 threat is pretty relevant, actually. So instead, we see knight d7 by Katerina, delaying any ideas of capturing this bishop. And now I just play the move queen e2. A nice improving move, defending the c4 pawn, supporting my pressure on the e-file as well. Now knight d to f6 was played in the game, And once again, I'd like you guys to pause and try to find the plan here for white. What are some moves that definitely come to mind if you're playing here with the white pieces? What are some of the plans? So black can only defend in the Carlsbad structure if he has no bishops. That's kind of one way of putting it, Beltron, in reference to the previous game. Obviously, every game is going to be different. In that specific case, I think it is true that active plans were very, very hard to come by for Julian there. He managed to come up with one, but it turns out it was not a great one. But yeah, I think more natural is not to say he can only defend, but just to prepare for the opening up of the queenside with a move like a5, keeping the queenside pawn sort of restricted for white, and then eventually white's probably going to break through over there, but black at least then will be ready for the opening of the queenside. And there, it's not so much that he'll be defending, but that he'll be ready for the opening up of the position. So he'll have his own activity as well. Okay, a lot of suggestions revolving around playing the move e4. Knight e5 followed by f3 and e4. Yeah, that's actually not my favorite idea in this position. Generally, the chat is like answering all these questions no problem, but yeah, knight e5 is definitely not a bad move at all. Let's say my opponent were to continue with a move like, I don't know, bishop d7. Now if I start playing stuff like f3, knight takes f4 is going to be a lot more problematic. The second you play f3, you're weakening a ton of dark squares. Now if I go for the same sort of business with e takes f5, sort of the stonewall move you never expect to see might come on the board with c5. And you are weakening a lot when you play this move f3. I did mention this as a just in case you need to control these light squares, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be the plan here, to play for a move like e4. And if g takes f4 here, still a move like c5, and these dark squares are going to come under just a little bit of fire. So I'm not a huge fan of f3. Knight e5 is always going to be a fine move in this position, though. The plan I was actually looking at is the plan of, once again, playing on the queen side with stuff like b4 and b5. So moves I would definitely be considering, moves like rook fc1, moves like rook ac1, moves like c5, moves like a3 going for b4. These are all things that I would very, very much be considering in the game. In the game, I chose rook a to b1 rather than any of those options, and this is just going for much of the same stuff. There was a question, though, why didn't Katerina take on c4 and reinforce with b5? And the reason here is generally because of this monster bishop sitting on g2, sort of lying in wait for black to do just this. After d takes c4, you are immediately running into knight e5, when if you play b5, c6 hangs, if you don't, c4 hangs, and you're just really giving this bishop a little bit too much activity here. So that's why no takes on c4. However, in the game, we see rook a b1, a5 by Katerina, and then I actually go for something very, very similar to what we saw in the last game. I played the move knight a4, trying to play the move, not knight c5 in this case, but rather c5 and knight b6, going for just total domination on the queen side. And I do think this is a perfectly fine way of playing in this position. Now, in the game, Katerina hit me with the move d takes c4, highlighting the fact that queen takes c4 might be a little bit of a mistake. Tactically, this is actually working out for black. Just the move b5 is going to be picking up a piece here. If you think you're being very, very clever with queen takes c6, gaining a tempo on the rook, joke's on you, bishop d7 gains that tempo right back and is still winning this knight for free. So, no queen takes c4 available, and now that Katerina is sort of committed to this, I do a total 180 on the plan, which is something that you shouldn't be afraid to do in your chess games. And that's why I like this game that I played so much, is because I did this sort of immediately. And what do I mean by doing a 180 on the plan? Well, the plan before was to play knight a4 and c5 and knight b6. Obviously, that plan is sort of out the window once the move d takes c4 happens. Now, does that mean I'm sort of committed to having this knight on a4 and over-justifying it? Well, no, it actually doesn't. And so in the game, I played the move knight c3. And knight e5 is obviously a very, very good move, and it might have even been slightly better than the move knight c3, but the point still stands. Knight c3 isn't a bad move, and the point is, whenever there's a serious change in structure, like with d takes c4, you really do have to sit down, take a lot of time, and reevaluate what's going on in the game. And the fact of the matter is, this knight on a4 was really only hindering my ideas, and so I brought it back to c3 as soon as this move d takes c4 was sort of played. So once again, my past two moves were knight a4, knight c3, and somehow white is still doing well here. Now, is that to say you should always kind of just repeat moves aimlessly like this? No, of course not. But I do think it made a little bit of sense, at least here, even if objectively knight e5 was a bit better. So the moral of this story is very, very much to reevaluate every time there is a change in structure, because you might just find that what was working for you before is not working for you anymore, and you might have to adjust a little bit. In the game, Katerina plays the move bishop d7, defending the c6 pawn, sort of preparing for a move like b5. However, this is not true. Bishop d7 probably would have been a good move. Instead, in the game, she played the move knight d5, which is also fine. And now I snatched this pawn back before it was too late. You know, kind of get it while the getting's good. So I take on c4, and now she plays the move bishop d7, still preparing to kind of expand over here on the queen side. So, okay, let's regroup. We have won nothing. We have won our pawn back, I should say, on the c4 square, and now we need to come up with some new ideas for white. So what do you guys think? What should white be doing in this game now? What are going to be the ideas here? Knight on e5 is almost never bad here. Yes, fair enough, fair enough. Don't repeat aimlessly, repeat with a purpose. Beltron has it. Beltron has it figured out. So I'm seeing a couple one-move suggestions. That's not really what it's about. We're trying to come up with some kind of a plan here. Viral Stigma says to trade on d5 because his knight is better. Her knight in this case, rather. Bring out the rook. So these are some, you know, sort of short-term ideas. As far as long-term plans here, remember, with this move, rook b1 and knight a4, I was looking for long-term plans of expanding on the queen side. Stuff like this, you know, long-term plans where I was aiming for space over here. Then we had this drastic change in structure, and so the plans sort of change. And so here, now, after bishop d7, we've regained the pawn, and it's time to come up with these long-term plans again. Mark is now saying, go for an attack on the queen side after the e4 break. Then he says, never mind, that's a bad idea. Manny says, don't trade, then your bishop would be bad. A3 by Subakara, so still, Kura rather, going for this a3, b4 stuff is certainly one idea. And in this particular position, I decided that yes, still the queen side is where I wanted to be playing. It's true that sometimes some e4 breaks are definitely going to be well worth considering for white. I thought that, you know, white isn't really risking anything here, and I just wanted to sort of lock down on this queen side altogether. But the move I actually started with is, now that we've had a drastic change in structure, once again, it's time to reevaluate whether or not I'm happy with the current state of affairs. And I decided that I was actually no longer so happy giving up this bishop on f4. Now that things have opened up a little bit, Black would very much like to be able to use some of these squares for his pieces, including the d6 square as well. So I play the move bishop e5 rather than knight e5, with the idea of just preserving this bishop. So once again, moral of the story, reevaluate the entire position once a change in structure happens. No longer happy with losing this bishop, I now chose to save it with bishop e5. Now, black, with this knight on h5 being useless, decided to bring her knight back to f6. And now I play the move queen e2, just sort of getting out of the way on the queen's side. This queen was perhaps, while it looked actively placed, sort of in the way of all my other pieces. Bishop e8 now by black is aiming for some activity. And now I play the move knight e1, not ready to give black this exchange, and ready to come closer to my plan of control on the queen side of the board. Bishop h5 was now played, queen d2, and now b5 by Katerina, taking this queenside space. So once again, this is a pretty dramatic change in structure, but thankfully I was sort of preparing for this one, because now knight d3 is very, very natural, just keeping the c-pawn backwards, and now white's play is going to be extremely clear. White's play is going to be attack the c-pawn, win the game. And the fact of the matter is, this is just a dreadful position for black at this point. Black is the one with all the weaknesses, this weak pawn on c6. Black has less space. This bishop on e5 is a great piece. A knight on c5 is going to be a great piece. And the rest of black's pieces are sort of just disjointed, right? This bishop on h5, this bishop on e7, how do they make any sense together? They really don't. So great position here for white already. And so how did we get to such a great position out of the opening against Katerina Nemcova? Well, some of it is down to the stonewall being a little bit suspicious sometimes, but a lot of it, I think, is down to these moves like d takes c4 that Katerina played, sort of just trying to prove that knight a4 was somehow a bad move. When you overcommit to things like this and try and refute your opponent's ideas directly, that's when you run the risk of, actually being worse yourself. Some ideas in chess don't need to be refuted. You just need to find your own active play elsewhere on the board. So I think this move d takes c4 is sort of the beginning of the end here for Katerina. And now b5 is actually being very, very friendly to me. If she left this pawn on b7, it might still be a slightly awkward position for black, but at least, this b7 pawn being weak is a lot better than the c6 pawn being weak, because it's a lot harder to get to the b7 pawn. But in the game, we did see b5, now knight d3, and b4 was actually, once again, being a little bit too friendly. Now, I am actually quite happy to put this knight back on a4, because it makes sense with my pieces, once again, heading for c5. Knight d7 was Katerina's choice, and now I just bring a rook to the c file. Very, very natural. Rook c8, rook c2, just preparing to double, bishop back to e8, and rook f to c1. This is just the most natural chess I could think of, and it turns out it's just very, very good chess in this case. Rook f7 was her move, and honestly, just look at this position. If you're playing with, look at it from this side, right? Oh God, flip it back before I puke. This is so awful. This is just so, so awful. You can't move any of your pieces, and I hate this position for black, which means I was having a lot of fun in the game. So rook f7 was what she came up with, and honestly, it's not the most useful move in the world, but nothing really is here for black. So rook f7, why not? Now, this is the type of position where you can do nothing for 10 moves with white, and your position is not going to get any less good. So I played the move queen e2, which, believe it or not, is actually the best move in the position. The point is, queen's just more active on e2, aiming at squares like a6 or h5, depending on how the game progresses. And then after bishop f6, I decided now was the time to make my break, and so I brought this knight to c5. Now after knight takes c5, rook c5, this bishop dropped back to e7, and this rook dropped back to e2. And so we've just taken off one of these pieces for black now. And after bishop d7, the issue is, after knight c5, he's running out of ways to get rid of a knight sitting on the c5 square. In the game, she chose not to capture on c5, which might have been maybe the best bet. But of course now, moves like queen a6 are going to be sort of devastating for black, with this queen just getting way too active. Although I guess the move rook a8 is playable here, and the queen has to come back. But the point still stands. It's difficult to really do anything here for black. For example, if just a passing move, I think a move like a3 is already beginning to open things up favorably for white with things like this to follow. But, okay, in the game, she did not capture on c5. Instead, she chose to play the move bishop f8, trying to sort of untangle this rook. And now, white to move. Who sees the best move here for white? Yeah, c6 is weak, e6 is weak, everything is just so weak. So a lot of people are saying knight b7, which is a fun move. Knight takes d7 is being suggested. I am not in love with knight takes d7. I don't know why you would want to kill this bishop, right? Like, why are you trying to kill this guy for your opponent? Your opponent is so happy if this bishop falls off the board. So many people saying knight b7. What's the point of knight b7? I'm confused. Why do you guys want to play knight b7 so bad? I don't understand. Like, you want to go here, but let's take it. I mean, you're still winning, but like, why? So the move I played in the game is the move I like the best still, and it's the move e4. And this is a great way of approaching positions like this, in my opinion. Your opponent is totally tied down. Their pieces are all tangled up, getting in each other's way, because they have to defend all these weaknesses. So what do? Well, you open up more lines then. You open up more lines for your pieces to get into play while your opponent's pieces are uncoordinated and lacking active squares. So e4 played in the game. We have f takes e4, bishop takes e4, and now these are the bishops of dreams. Queen g5 was Katerina's move in the game, and unfortunately for her already, this is just dead lost. Knight takes d7 was now my choice in the game. I know I just made fun of you guys for taking off this bishop, but here, tactically, it is just totally winning. h4, queen h6, and then I could capture on c6, but rather than do so, which would allow a queen takes c1 with check. Not that white isn't winning here, white probably is winning here, but I played the move king g2 instead, just avoiding this line entirely. Now knight e7 comes on the board, and now queen a6 is sort of disgusting for black once again. All the pieces tied down, stepping on each other's toes. Okay, rook d to d8 was her choice. And now I just pick up the pawn on a5, and it's time to start collecting some material advantage. Knight f5 was her choice, trying to find some kind of activity over here. And I could have just immediately captured this guy, but I played the move queen b6 instead. Now she plays queen g6, making a threat. Turns out that this is a threat I could have just responded to with a move like king g1 or a move like king h3, and this would have been perfectly fine. Instead here, I kind of ruined the beautiful game I had played so far, as I often do. I sort of panicked and went for what I thought was going to be the easiest endgame of all time with bishop takes f5. Now a move like king g1 is actually just fantastic here. You can't ever take this now because it's not with check, and if queen g4, guess what? The move f3 is actually going to be really strong. If queen h3, that's a trapped queen, and if queen back to g6, once again, you have no threats here, and rook c6 is coming on the board quite quickly. But instead, I play the awful move that hurts to see every time, bishop takes f5. I gave up my beautiful bishop for this knight on f5. Disgusting stuff. I apologize. Queen f5, I do still get this pawn, but now after queen e4 check, king g1, rook c6, queen c6, queen c6, rook c6. The unfortunate news is that while I thought I was just going to be two clean pawns up here, turns out black is actually winning one of them back, which is not something I had really bargained for. So of course the move here for black is rook a8. I was like, not to worry, I knew I was losing that a pawn anyways. Rook takes e6 is still 2 pawns up. Now rook takes a2 was played, and d5 is the idea to defend the b2 pawn. But now my opponent does have rook a1 check, and rook over to d1. And this pawn on d5 is not looking quite as comfortable anymore with this rook sitting directly behind it. And so it turns out that this is, in fact, just black winning back this d pawn. In the game, I played bishop d6, rook takes d5, bishop takes f8, king takes f8, and now rook b6 getting behind this pawn on the b file. Turns out, though, that this is still going to be pretty good for white here. I should still be winning in this case. Rook d4 was played in the game, and now after rook b7, this king is just totally locked in on the 8th rank. h6 was her choice. Now after b3, Katerina sort of panicked and played the move g5, which is making the win a lot easier. And I'm not going to go into this endgame too in depth, but I will show you how the game finished here. And then if you want to see this endgame very thoroughly analyzed, stick around for the endgame class coming up right after this. But in the game, I played the move h5, king g8, king f1, rook over to e4, and now f3 was my idea of breaking through, making sure this rook could not stay along the 4th rank and also keep my king boxed out. Rook e3 was her choice, but now after rook takes b4, rook takes f3, king g2, rook c3, this is just now a clean passed pawn, and my king has a very direct path sort of into the game. And the game finished without too much controversy here, with this pawn getting pushed and my king coming into play over on the queen's side as such. And here, I believe Katerina resigned and forfeited from the tournament in disgust. That is all for tonight on the Road to 2000. Thank you guys so much for joining me here. Up next is going to be the endgame class, where I'm actually going to start with this exact endgame and walk you guys through it a little bit more slowly with a little bit more in-depth analysis. So be sure to stick around for that. With that in mind, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.